All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, but as you all are starting to come into the room, as people are coming in, please go ahead and introduce yourself into the chat. We'd love to hear from you. So welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for some of you. Thanks for joining us. We are very excited here today. My name is Robin Al-Haddad, and I am the Community Manager for QualME, which is IDEAL's Qualitative Monitoring and Evaluation peer community. And I'm happy to be welcoming you all here to this event. Today we're featuring the new IDEAL's Qualitative Assessment Toolkit. So hopefully you all have received a copy of that toolkit before this event, and you've had a chance to kind of take a look at it and get yourself familiar with it. The purpose of today's session is really to familiarize yourself with the toolkit and get an introduction to the toolkit. But specifically for qualitative monitoring, you know, tools like the QuIPS, we're going to get a little hands-on practice on developing a qualitative inquiry design. This event is not really meant to be like a deep dive into the toolkit. So today's session, we're just going to get a brief overview of the toolkit. So we're not going to expect that we'll be able to cover everything in great detail today during today's session, just because we have time limitations. However, there will be a new M&E Qualitative Inquiry e-course that's coming up very soon, where you can get more in-depth learning on the Qualitative Assessment Toolkit and the contents of it. And we'll talk a bit more about the e-course a little bit later on in this session. But again, this is a peer community, so we'd like to get everybody to know each other a little bit better. As you come into the room, please introduce yourself in the chat box and put your name, your organization, the position where you are based, and you can put all that response into the chat. The QualME events are generally held once per quarter, and each meeting has a different topic of discussion. So today, as you all know, we are focusing on learning about the IDEAL's new Qualitative Assessment Toolkit. So after a brief introduction to the toolkit, we will then break out into small groups for group work. This will be a hands-on working session, so we really encourage you all and everyone to participate and to come prepared to work today. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to introduce Hillary Cook for some opening remarks. So Hillary Cook is our Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor and Acting Team Lead of the M&E team for USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. So welcome, Hillary, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, everybody. My name is Hillary Cook. As Robin just said, I'm an M&E advisor here at BHA. And right now I'm the acting team lead for the BHA M&E team. It's really nice to see some familiar folks in this meeting from work on this and other things over the years. So the BHA M&E team and the IDEAL team, we've been working on furthering support for qualitative data collection and its use for several years now. So our team is really excited about this toolkit and workbook that we're going to be discussing today and working through today. This accompanies our own M&E technical guidance. So this all started 5 or 6 years ago through collaborative engagements between the BHA and implementing partner M&E community. And our partner colleagues expressed interest in better using qualitative data within their activities, and our team was particularly interested in seeing more rigor in the qualitative plans that were being submitted to us. So in 2021, BHA M&E, we updated our M&E guidance to reflect both the acceptance and appreciation of implementers building qualitative data collection into their M&E plans. So our hopes with all of this is that you can use rigorous qualitative methods to inform your programming in meaningful ways in the service of the participants of your activities. So I just want to thank everyone for being here today and for your interest in improving and using qualitative methods in your work. And a huge thank you to our IDEAL colleagues for all the hard work on this toolkit and the workbook, and for the long collaborations with our team, in particular, Robin and Karen, thank you so much. So we're excited to participate in this today. There's several of us joining, there's several of us from our team here. And we look forward to seeing how you all integrate this into your work.
Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
It said the host muted me. Thank you. I think my time, that means my time is up, but thank you all. We're looking forward to seeing how this gets built into your work and here to support it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Now I'm going to introduce Karen Fox. She's going to give us an overview of the Qualitative Toolkit. Karen is a senior research advisor at Tango International, where she's been working and monitoring and evaluation and research for over 20 years. Among other roles at Tango, she supports qualitative M&E with the Ideal Award, and her training is in international agricultural development and ecological and social cultural anthropology. Her most recent work includes mixed method impact evaluations of resilience activities and outcome monitoring in Ethiopia, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria, where she focuses on the qualitative component. In 2017, she started working with M&E colleagues at USAID's former Office of Food for Peace, which is now the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, to support the integration of qualitative methods into M&E for USAID funded activities. So we will have a few minutes after Karen does her presentation for our Q&A. So as you listen to her presentation about the toolkit, please feel free to either use the raise your hand button or to drop your question into the chat, and we will try to respond to your question after Karen presents. So now over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Hillary. Can you hear me? I'm having some audio issues, as fate would have it.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, because unfortunately, I've only caught about every other word. Hillary, I trust that we've worked together long enough on this that I have a sense of what your opening remarks referred to. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joined today and for all of the people who've made this toolkit possible. There's a big group of contributors. I'd like to note in particular Hillary Cook and Nancy Peak from BHA, who's also on the line, and a number of other contributors, including our implementing partners and a number of people with BHA who've seen various versions and manifestations of this over time. And this toolkit, we're so excited to be able to share with you today. It's sort of the consolidated manifestation of a lot of bits and pieces that have been emerging over the last several years. So with that, just to give a quick overview of what we'd like to do today. First, as Robin said, just to introduce the toolkit. We want to give you a look inside if you haven't already had the chance to do that, but save most of our time for some group work. Rather than talk about what's in the toolkit, we want to actually dive in, at least to one section of this. And of course, with QualME, one of our overall objectives is always to connect with other M&E colleagues and researchers who are similarly interested and in some cases very passionate about qualitative work. So just a quick overview of the agenda. I'll be giving an overview of the toolkit. Robin mentioned we will have a few moments for Q&A. I'd also like to bring in our other colleagues who've helped to contribute to this, to respond to questions that you may have in the chat or by raising a hand. And then we're going to jump right into breakout groups. We're lucky we've got a handful of facilitators who are going to be joining each of our groups to help us walk through a series of research questions and actually get into some sort of superficial, I guess we can say, designing of an actual qualitative inquiry planning sheet. So nothing that we're going to run out and implement right away, but just a chance to get into the toolkit and see how it feels. And then we'll turn it back over to Robin for some closing remarks. And of course, we always appreciate, as you know, an M&E group, your comments through an evaluation. So why qualitative? And perhaps I'm speaking to the choir here, but I think we all know that we tend to focus our inquiry on quantitative indicators, on quantitative evidence. But we really benefit from, and we know the importance of qualitative research to help us understand how and why, what's really going on. So in part, it's to help to contextualize and interpret quantitative findings, but it's also by doing rigorous and well thought out systematic qualitative research, we can better understand some of these underlying dynamics that are quite difficult to assess when we're using only quantitative information. In particular, clusters of activities. You know, we use our quantitative information to perhaps find out what types of activities people are engaged in, what the adoption rate may be, what the use of those activities may be. But with the qualitative, we can really get a better sense of how those activities are working together. And to do that from the experience and the perspective of our participants on the ground who are actually engaging in our interventions. Next slide. So I think as Hillary, I believe, would have mentioned, again, this has been some years in the making, and started with the introduction of some qualitative guidance in the BHA and Legacy Food for Peace, RIFSA guidance for monitoring and evaluation, as well as for emergency activities. So there is some guidance in those documents, and we encourage you, if you haven't already, to look in there. We've got the links provided here. But those documents primarily they lay out the how, or they lay out the what, some idea of what's involved in qualitative research for monitoring for our emergency and development or resilience activities. And what we realized is that we really need to have more of the how. And that's where this toolkit came from. But the primary purpose, and I think, I hope Hillary articulated this, is really just to support and encourage the use of rigorous and robust qualitative research as part of our M&E system. We were, over the years, hearing a lot of qualitative anecdotes or success stories. And realizing that there's a lot of qualitative information that's being collected all of the time from our program and M&E staff. And the idea here is to really develop a process whereby we can use that qualitative information as evidence for making decisions. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the idea here is to develop some guidance for thoughtful and systematic design. Often when we're doing some kind of qualitative training or qualitative activity, we'll ask, okay, what's qualitative research? And often the response is, it's an FGD, or it's a key informant interview, or it's a topical outline. And yes, those are all obviously parts of qualitative research. But what we realized is that if we need to step back a little bit and think about it as more of an overall process. Anytime we set out to do a quantitative study, we have a protocol that we follow. And this toolkit is really to set out a similar type of protocol for qualitative research. So we do that using this QuIPS tool, the Qualitative Inquiry Planning Sheet, which you probably have had a chance to look at and will definitely be jumping into together in our working groups today. Throughout the toolkit, you'll see a series of core questions that help us to kind of think through how we might apply each section of the QuIPS, as well as some exercises where we can actually practice that application. I also wanted to point out that the toolkit comes with a companion workbook, and that's in MS Word. So it's a tool that's meant for you to use almost like a qualitative inquiry planning journal. And it provides some templates and just space to work through your design. So this slide just basically sets out the table of contents for the toolkit itself. And you'll see it's laid out in a series of steps. So although we know qualitative planning and qualitative inquiry isn't chronological per se, it's iterative, we still have a series of steps, and this helps to lay them out one by one, in part so that we just make sure we're thinking about each of them. And I'll get into some of these steps a little bit more when we take a look at the next slide on the QuIPS tool. Okay, so here it is, the QuIPS. And I have to say that it's essentially just a protocol, right? A step-by-step communication tool that articulates how one will carry out any kind of research or study. And when I first was working with our team to develop this QuIPS, my initial reaction was, well, we can't put all of these things into these boxes. It's qualitative research. But really what's, I think, useful about this QuIPS is just like any type of qualitative inquiry, it can expand, it's flexible, it's adaptive, so it can move with you. So it's essentially just a tool to help us think through each of those steps, and then to have a place to record that and then communicate what we're planning to do with our partners, with BHA and other stakeholders. And again, the whole idea is that at the same time that we're thinking about what our qualitative tool or method may be, we need to be thinking ahead to how we're going to analyze that data, because that informs how much we're going to be able to collect. We need to think about how we're going to be using or applying or sharing that data right from the start. So this just, again, helps us to think through each of those steps as we begin the process of qualitative research design. So in addition to the QuIPS and walking us through each of those steps in the document itself, the toolkit also includes a number of annexes, including the template, which, as I mentioned, you'll also find in the workbook. Some additional resources that you can link to for qualitative information. And I think, as we all know, there is a vast array of qualitative approaches, methods, and tools, some of which are being developed under the Ideal Qualitative Program Award and feature here on QualME. So if you haven't already, please stay tuned. We'll have another QualME event in September where we'll be featuring some more of our qualitative tools. But the number of qualitative tools we could use is somewhat endless. So here we just provide some background on some key tools that people tend to use and appreciate. But you'll see here the first points on the bullet are the key informant interviews and focus group discussions. And really, I think that gets to what this toolkit is all about. It's really just foundational approaches and processes for doing qualitative inquiry. And that tends to begin with the foundational key informant interview and focus group discussions. If we can do that really, really well, then we can add on some of these other approaches around multi-criteria analysis or the outcome harvesting work that was presented by CRS last week. So a whole array of tools. So anyway, you'll see in the annexes a number of tools that we hope you find useful, and some tools also to help with our qualitative analysis. So let's go to the next slide, and then we'll take a look inside. Okay, so step one. Again, we're not going to go into these steps in great detail because we want to make sure that you have time to get into at least one piece of this in detail. But step one is really just that thought piece. When we're communicating with our partners, we're looking at our quantitative data and we're seeing some trends that don't make sense, or we're seeing some places where adoption of an activity is really high and other areas where it may be low, and we want to understand why. So it's, what are the questions that we have, and what's the evidence that we need to answer those questions? So again, the toolkit just starts right at the very beginning, thinking through that those questions. Next slide. Now, step two, defining the purpose, objectives, and the study questions or the inquiry questions is really the critical piece here, right? Because again, when I said we ask people, well, what's qualitative research? And the response is a topical outline. That's way down the line, right? That's our tool. And that tool is developed based on our research questions. So it's really important we get those research questions right. Often we'll see research questions that number in the 10s or 20s. And again, these are our higher level questions that we want to focus on. So this first step is really, really critical. It's really getting to, what is it that we want to study? What's the purpose? And how are we going to do that? So yeah, go ahead and switch to, oh wait, first I just wanted to mention, there's some language in this QuIPS and in the toolkit that are pretty specific to BHA programming. For example, the data type. And so this is relating to the types of data that you'll typically be collecting through your ongoing monitoring of activities or evaluations. But it's really to think through, how does the question that we have relate back to our theory of change? Are we looking at the outcome level? Are we looking more at the process level of our activity? Is it really contextual information that we need to understand why sort of financial insecurity, or why a conflict, or why some structural constraint may be constraining the extent to which people can engage in the interventions that an activity may be doing? So that's what we mean by the data type. So speaking of the language that's kind of specific to BHA activities in the QuIPS, another one that you'll see right up top is QM or QS, so qualitative monitoring or qualitative study. So by monitoring, we mean that routine data collection that's built into your program. Could be even some sentinel site type data collection, where you've identified particular target areas by some agroecological or livelihood zone where you want to be consistently capturing qualitative information that complements your quantitative data collection over time. Or it could be that you really want to understand what the unexpected outcomes are of a gender activity that you're doing in one particular part of your target area. So we call that the qualitative study or a discrete study. So that's something that the QuIPS asks you to specify. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and this is the important part, right? The research question, because really everything else in our design follows from that research question. So what makes it a good one? As I've already mentioned, kind of higher level, a broader question that's few in number, focus on a specific issue, something that we can actually research and understand. And I mentioned earlier how important it is to identify a question that helps us to fill our knowledge gaps. So in doing that, it's important to draw on some of that anecdotal, perhaps, information that you may have collected, but as well as the data that you have at hand, whether it's data that you're collecting through your own project or secondary sources. And critically, it needs to be realistic and something that fits into your own activity cycle. Next slide, please. So you all should have received some research questions. We know the QuIPS is, has many parts. It can take some time in a real design process to think through each of these steps, and particularly to think through those research questions. So we've gone ahead and provided each of our working groups with, part one, step one and step two are already completed for you, where we've given you some background on the activity. See, I've used the word fabricated, but it's these are not real activities in real questions. These are things that we've cooked up for the sake of practice today. But again, we've gone through and set out a series of research questions, and each of those QuIPS, I believe, has just 3 questions with some sub-questions attached that really get at the nature of the context. So here, the nature of shocks and stresses. We want to get at issues around gender equity and women's empowerment, the things that, again, are difficult to capture through our quantitative methods. And then you'll notice that the questions focus on how and why and to what extent, because that's what we want to get at using our qualitative inquiry. Okay, next slide, please, Bella. Okay, so this is where our group work, I think we can back up one slide. Great, thanks. So this is where we really get into our own group work today. And here you'll see a section of the QuIPS that's been pulled out and put onto this slide, and you'll have it with you in your working group. But this is the meat of it, right? Once we've identified those research questions, which is our North Star, then we want to get into those steps around the design and methodology. And again, with qualitative research, as with any study, we have a lot of choices to make, a lot of decisions. And so the idea is that at each of those decision points, when we're determining what methods we're going to use, what tools we're going to develop, what our sampling strategy will be, that at each of those points, we're looking back to the research questions, the North Star, to make sure that the choice, the decision that we're making helps us to answer those questions. So again, here we're going to get into the design. So this is your task today. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. And again, you'll see and you'll work in your groups to go through each one of these steps, starting with the research methods. You know, we have, again, a full array of methods to choose from. Some of those are kind of interview-based. You know, we've got here case studies or focus groups. We often use, as you know, key informed interviews, but we have, and as you'll see in the annex to the toolkit, a whole array of participatory activities as well, and ways to mix and match those various approaches so that we can really better understand the perspective and experience of the participants we're serving. In thinking about the tools, you know, we have a note here on the bottom. Just want to make sure that this is communicated very, very clearly. We talk about our qualitative researchers as researchers. And the idea is that just as we're making a decision that relates back to the research question at every step in the design process, our researchers are always making decisions as well in the process of data collection. And we talk about, even when we're sitting down to go through a tool, it's not really about the tool. It's about making sure that our researchers really understand and contribute to the research questions themselves, understanding what it is we really want to understand. And after that, the tool falls naturally, right? It's more of a tool that helps us to navigate a discussion within a set of parameters. At each point, referring back to what's that research question? What do we really want to understand? And so we have a saying that we've picked up from a few of our qualitative gurus that really, when it comes to doing qualitative work, you are the method, the researcher is the method, you are the most important tool, which is something to keep in mind in all of our qualitative inquiry. Next slide, please. Can we jump ahead to the next slide, please? Great, thanks, Bella. Oh, let's see. Okay, here we are, sampling. And again, we're not getting into every bit of the toolkit, just trying to pull out some highlights, some key things we want to make sure we keep in mind. And one of those is sampling. And sampling in qualitative research is sort of an often overlooked and super critical component. I guess I've used the word critical a few times, but you know, again, it goes back to the research question. You know, what is it that we want to understand? So, you know, again, with any quantitative study, we have some strict guidelines and strict approaches that we'll follow in order to ensure that we've got our sampling right. It's not so straightforward, right, in qualitative research. But still, that sampling piece is absolutely critical to make sure that whatever our question is, we're capturing the range of variability that we're looking for from our study participants. And that all means really understanding or really thinking through what are the criteria that we want to use to kind of select communities, households, individuals that we want to interview, that we want to use in our participatory mapping exercises. So let's jump to the next slide. I've got one more on sampling. Yeah, Bella, can we skip one more slide? We can back up one. Okay, here we go. Selection criteria. And again, this is the process whereby we're really thinking deeply about our target population. So it could be, you know, all participants in all of our activities, interventions throughout our entire target area, or it could be specific communities where we're seeing change in our quantitative indicators up or down that we want to investigate further. Or it could be a place where we piloted, you know, a new activity and really want to explore that more deeply. But within those target populations, then we really have to think through what the selection criteria are. And just like in determining the number of research questions, we want to keep those criteria very specific and, you know, few in number. Often those criteria relate to something like a particular livelihood activity or participation in a VSLA or a farmers or a mothers group. It could be criteria based on access and feasibility, but we want to make sure that we're interviewing people who live in very rural areas where they may not have access to services, or in urban areas or closer to towns where they have greater access to financial services, for example. So we want to identify what's the criteria that we want to use to understand our research question. And through that, we'll carry that through the disaggregation of the analysis as well. So the sampling stage is really, really important. We often get the question of, well, you know, how much is enough? And again, in our quantitative designs, we have formulas that we can use to help determine our sampling frame or sampling size. In qualitative, again, it's not quite that clear cut. I think what we do often find and sometimes forget in qualitative work is that we want to go deep. We want to go, this is our opportunity to go deep. For broad, we have our quantitative tools. So what we find is that the learning from the qualitative inquiry around patterns and trends, exceptions, examples, those types of insights tend to come sooner than we might expect. So saturation, we've got some specific resources that you can dive into that are included or linked to in the toolkit itself. This is a tricky widget, I know, but it's something to very carefully think through in your design process. And again, the number of interviews you have is going to relate to the selection criteria. So you want to make sure that you have enough people that you're interviewing systematically to cover that range of variation that you're interested in. Next slide, please. So again, just some greatest hits from the toolkit. Another one of those being the training requirements. Over time, we've seen sort of a decrease in resources and effort put into qualitative training. We put a lot of time into our tool design and sometimes less into training. And remember, in qualitative work, we are the tool. So it's really important that we invest in ourselves and in our researchers, and really ensuring that, you know, everyone on board very much understands the research questions themselves and is also contributing to those tools. They're not fixed, right? They're dynamic, and often kind of revising those tools and ensuring that we all understand the sampling frame. You know, that all happens during training, and it all takes time. It's also so critical that we ensure time for practice and piloting, and that includes piloting the tools, piloting the data entry, piloting, you know, a little bit of that analysis even, because we're doing that analysis iteratively in the field, that sort of preliminary iteration as we go through the process of data collection to make sure that we're answering our research questions and filling that gap. So just a nod to training to ensure that we're always allocating sufficient time for that before we set out on any qualitative inquiry. Next slide. Okay, another oft overlooked aspect of qualitative research is the data entry, data management, and data quality assurance. And I'm going to focus specifically on the data management piece. Data entry, often in our training, as I mentioned, we focus on the tool, but it's equally important to make sure that we're giving people a chance to practice data entry, that critical piece. And that also takes time in the field, right? We tend to allocate or recommend allocating at least a full day of data entry for every day of data collection. And so again, you're thinking through your design process systematically. And this is a critical thing to think of or think about when you're planning your logistics and operations and implementation plan. We often like to use recorders, and it's wonderful to have access to increasingly access, we don't have to use a tape deck anymore, right? Having that cell phone on hand to take a recording or some other device is incredibly useful. But I wish I could see a show of hands right now for any of you who have had a recorder or, you've gotten authorization to use video, and that device either stops working or, perhaps in a rush, maybe we forgot to actually turn it on. I don't know who might have done that at some point in time. It happens. And so we always use those recordings as a backup. Taking good notes, and the skill of note taking is critical, and it's a learned, practiced skill. And again, we're lucky to have those recording devices because we can go back and verify or get that exact quote that we might have missed in real time. But that note taking piece is critical. Another critical piece, as I mentioned, data management, and equally important that during our training, everyone understands what that system is for managing data. And it makes life so much easier when we're getting to the process of analysis. Quality assurance, that's not something that happens at the end when we're reviewing our data or working in our analysis. It's something that starts at the very beginning and runs all the way through. Often that internal check and cross-check, triangulation with our design team. Is this decision, is this tool, is this method, is this helping us to will this answer our research question? Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, the data analysis plan. We're not going to get into analysis today. I've got a link here for one of the QualME events. I think our first QualME event last year that focused on analysis. So some specific guidance there. But really just to again, remind us all that when we're thinking about the design from the very beginning, we're also thinking simultaneously about how we're going to analyze it. How are we going to allocate sufficient time and resources for that analysis? What tools are we going to use? Are we going to use computer-assisted software? Are we going to use a manual or a narrative approach? And then how are we going to disaggregate that data? Again, linking back to our sampling criteria, our selection criteria and sampling. If we know we need to understand differences between men and women, between elders and youth, then we need to make sure that our selection criteria include those units of disaggregation that we're going to be using in the analysis. And then finally, is thinking through that plan for who's going to be using the data and how are we going to share it, whether it's visually, whether it's in a report form, whether it's a dashboard, whatever that may be. How is it going to be used? And how does that fit into the activity cycle? Is it for a redesign towards the end? If so, by when do we need to have this study finished? Is it part of our ongoing qualitative monitoring? If so, how does that work with regard to seasonality, with respect to holidays or events, those types of things? So kind of always thinking through how does the data collection and how does the deliverable of that information fit into the activity cycle or some other timeline so that it's actually useful. Now that you've gone to all the trouble to develop rigorous qualitative inquiry, how are we going to make sure that we're using it? Next slide, please. So finally, limitations of the study, risks, ethical review. Above all, the safety of the people we're interviewing, the safety of our teams, their protection, that always comes absolutely first. above all the other selection criteria. So again, from the very beginning, thinking through what some of those limitations and risks may be, how do we ensure everyone's safety, and what are the actual processes or approvals that are required, and how does that fit into the timeline of the implementation of our study. So with that, I think one final slide. Yep. So if you do have questions on the toolkit, here are some names and contact emails. We'd love to hear from you, and we're really excited. I think the toolkit's already been sort of taken up and used and applied in Malawi, and some good feedback there. So we do look forward to hearing from you as you hopefully use this toolkit in your own research. And thanks again for tuning in today and for taking some time to walk through that toolkit with us. So thanks. Over to you, Robin.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, for that great overview of the toolkit. I'm going to just give it like 2 minutes to see if anybody has any burning questions. Please feel free to either put it into the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. So I'll just give it a minute and see if anybody has any questions for Karen or anybody else. I see some questions on translation. I'm not sure if there are plans for translation into French or Spanish. Do we know if that's in the works?
I don't believe it is now, but I appreciate the question, and I think it's something we can take forward, and it would be wonderful.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Oh, I see a hand raised.
Oh, okay. I can't see it. Who is? Can you?
My name is Mustaq. I'm from Bangladesh. So I was just wondering about this is really great. The presentation I was looking for so long actually. So I was wondering about some like other the kind of qualitative analysis that we do for context analysis or thematic analysis or grounded theory. So for this type of different specific kind of qualitative analysis, is there any recommendation for you, for us, that we can use this kind of tools for grounded theory, or this kind of tools for thematic analysis, or any other kind of suggestions? Would you please? That would be great, really helpful for us. Thank you.
Well, Mustaq, thank you for that question. And again, I know analysis is always such a critical question. Again, the toolkit itself doesn't get into the details of how to do different types of analysis. It's more focused, again, on this overall process or protocol for designing qualitative inquiry with some resources that it links to for analysis. But again, the type of analysis that you use always refers back to the question that you ask right from the beginning. So you'll see, again, the link to the QualME event on analysis. We started there somewhat, the back end of qualitative inquiry rather than at the design phase, because we know that analysis is such a critical question, a critical component. So tune into that. And again, it's something that I think IDEAL or the QualME community can also share additional resources on.
Thanks. I see one more question in the chat. Are you able to share the Malawi experience in testing the tool?
So, and with that, I'm going to ask Hillary to unmute, if you could.
Yeah, and if Alice Kaponda, if you would also like to join me in answering this, please feel free to join me here. I can start. Yeah, I went to Malawi just a couple weeks ago. Alice is on a Tutukulani RIFSA, that the BHA funded Tutukulani RIFSA. So we were trying this out for the first time. It was a fantastic experience. We kind of piloted it with external people facilitating all of this, I think one of the big reflections, and this is why I don't want people to wait for translations for the toolkit yet, you could really have somebody from the M&E team, like the M&E team could lead this internally, and folks wouldn't even have to necessarily, like folks on the team wouldn't even necessarily have to read the toolkit. The toolkit can really be, I think, well picked up and used by the M&E team facilitating this whole process with technical advisors. We had a fantastic experience. We did a 6-day workshop, and Alice, if you would like to speak to how Tutukulani is going to move forward with it. We did a lot in just 6 days. We piloted data collection in the field and just gave a taste of every single step along the way. I'm not sure that's how the toolkit would be used by an activity on an ongoing basis. It might be stretched out more and do piece by piece to design it. But yeah, it was a fantastic first experience applying it. Alice, would you like to add anything? Please feel free to introduce yourself too to the group.
Yes, Hilary. Thanks, I'm Alice Kaponda, the MEL coordinator for this project in Malawi. Yeah, I think much has been spoken by Hilary. Just to add on, we had a wonderful experience going through the toolkit itself, and from the simple process that we did, as Hilary has explained, we managed to do the actual pre-testing in the field. We had just a small sample, but then the outcomes from what the data that we collected, we're able to generate some key findings which were really beneficial, and they could be useful to the project itself, even to the project designing. So overall, I can say that the tool is really useful. It's something which is simple to use. The moment you understand the steps themselves and the processes, the application itself is quite easy. And the information generation is much a little bit different with the quantitative. So it's something that will beef up the quantitative data collection, which we do routinely. Yeah, so basically that's what I can add. But I can frankly say that the toolkit, it's really something which is useful to generate the information which can inform the programming as well as decision making in the projects. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Alice. Yes, I know that the feedback that we got in Malawi is also going to be incorporated into editing this toolkit and making some changes to it. We are a bit short on time. I think I see lots of comments in the chat, but we're going to have to move on now. So I'm going to give some quick instructions for the small groups. We will now break out into our small groups, and we have about 70 minutes overall to go into these small groups to work together to complete the QuIPS planning sheet. To get started, each working group will be assigned a research question, a purpose, objectives of a qualitative study based on a thematic area that you chose during your registration. So when you registered for this event, you indicated your interest in either joining the VSLA group, the WASH group, or the gender group. So you will work with your team to design your own qualitative inquiry and complete the QuIPS template. Each team will fill in only just one template form, okay? And the group should also assign a note taker to fill in that QuIPS form. Because of time constraints, we're not going to have enough time really to get through the entire QuIPS form. We're probably only going to focus on section 2 of the QuIPS. So section 1 of the QuIPS, the purpose, objective, research questions, and data type, like we already mentioned, this section has already been filled out for you. So it's the same scenario that you probably received through email. I believe Bella sent out an email to everybody who registered. So you should have already received that QuIPS form with the scenario. And this kind of helps your team get started on designing a qualitative study. So please first just read through that section 1, and then you're going to move on to section 2. Section 2 is the design and methodology section, and we will take about 60 minutes in our working groups to work on this design and methodology portion of the QuIPS template. So each room will have an assigned facilitator who will give us a quick explanation and some tips on completing that section of the QuIPS. They will have some discussion questions for your group to consider as well. And as you work together to design your study, each team will need to assign someone in the group to start filling out the QuIPS. It's going to be on a Google Doc that you will fill out. And again, because of time constraints, you're not going to likely get to sections 3 or 4, but if your group happens to work very quickly, you can go ahead and move on to sections 3 and 4. After Bella's going to give us some time, give us some time prompts to let us know when it's time to move on. So the last 10 minutes in our groups, we're going to work on a peer review feedback. So we will take about 10 minutes at the end for peer review, and your team will exchange your QuIPS template with the other thematic group who's in the same theme. So for example, Group 1 and Group 4, the VSLA groups, you will exchange. Groups 2 and 5, who are WASH groups, you will exchange your QuIPS. And groups 3 and 6, who are gender, will also exchange your QuIPS. You will get the link to the other group's QuIPS form, and you can go onto their QuIPS and kind of review it and make a few comments and suggestions and praises. If you see some great, interesting things, feel free to make some comments on the other group's QuIPS. So, all right, so now we will be back in just over an hour. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all learned something new today. We hope that you feel a bit more prepared to use the ideal QuIPS Qualitative Assessment Toolkit. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for making this a great workshop. And I specifically want to thank Karen Fox, Nancy Peak, Hillary Cook, Ellie Cuellar, Derek Simon, Alice Capanda, Allison White, and Laura Zilmer for all of you for facilitating our small group discussions today. Thanks also to Bella for being our technical lead. And unfortunately, it's time to wrap up today's session. But just as a final request, we'd like to get some feedback from you all. So we greatly appreciate it if you could follow the link that's being posted into the chat so you can answer a very short evaluation survey about today's event. This helps us kind of enhance future events and make it better. And also, if you think you might be interested in the QualME peer community, you can indicate your interest in that form. Also, I just want to remind people that we do have a new M&E Qualitative Inquiry e-course that's going to be coming out very soon. And in that e-course, you can get more in-depth training on the Qualitative Toolkit. So the course will not only teach you how to design and conduct a qualitative inquiry, but it also has the practical tools for monitoring and evaluation and learning activities. And the e-course is in the development phase right now. So IDEAL is looking for a few practitioners to beta test this e-course before it's officially launched. If you're interested in beta testing the e-course and having sort of a hand in shaping that course before it's officially released, please sign up by using the Google form. There's a link that should be posted in our chat for the Google form, or you can use that QR code that's up on your screen if you're interested in being a beta tester. So, so there's a place also in the evaluation form where you can indicate your interest in that as well. So we'll also be sending out a follow-up email from this event. In the next few days, you'll receive the materials from today's event, including the slide deck and the recording of today's session and more information about the e-course we'll be soon. Please be on the lookout in the FSM newsletter for upcoming events in this series. Our next QualME event is going to be September 2023, so just in September, and it's going to be about participatory qualitative tools and approaches to support adaptive management. So thanks again to everybody who joined us today, and have a great rest of your day.